In 2001, a 72-year-old man was arrested in Miami alongside several police officers for trafficking cocaine. Okay, why do I care about this? I mean, the newspaper article about this incident from 20 years ago doesn't even seem to care about this guy. He's mentioned once offhand, like, yeah, and there's this old guy there too, and the story is understandably more focused on the crooked Miami cops. But you know what? I really care about this septuagenarian Miami drug dealer because he's not just a septuagenarian Miami drug dealer. In fact, that's probably the least interesting thing about him. But for some reason, nobody seems to remember Warren Hart. Seriously, Google Warren Hart. It's a pretty common name. You're going to find some LinkedIn accounts, some obituaries, some college professors. In the first 10 pages of Google results, I could actually only find 3 mentions of the Warren Hart that I'm interested in. And 2 of those are buried in articles that aren't even really about him, but they do get closer to who Warren Hart actually was. So about that 3rd Google result. Okay, let's set the scene. It's the fall of 1968. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated earlier that year, resulting in widespread race riots across the United States and North America, as well as giving the civil rights movement an increased sense of urgency. Public support for the Vietnam War was waning, second-wave feminism, widespread civil rights movements. It's the late 60s, a lot is happening. And crucially, the FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, was in full swing. Now, you might not know COINTELPRO by name, but you've probably heard of this. It refers to a series of covert and super illegal projects carried out by the FBI during the 50s and 60s. From surveillance to psychological warfare, to wrongful imprisonment, to assassination plots, to funding and arming right-wing paramilitary groups, the FBI was doing whatever it took to discredit, disrupt, and destroy whatever groups and movements it felt were too subversive or too radical. And one of its primary targets was the Black Liberation Movement. So that's the political and social climate when this guy, Warren Hart, just kind of comes out of nowhere and helps start the Baltimore chapter of the Black Panther Party. Here's what little we know about him. He was born in 1928 and served in the Korean War. He would have been in his late 30s or 40s when he was part of the Baltimore Black Panthers. Here he is serving food to some kids as part of the Panthers' free breakfast program. But according to several accounts, Hart ran the chapter much more like a social club than a radical revolutionary political group. Eddie Conway, a fellow member of the Baltimore Black Panthers, certainly felt that way and was getting a little bit suspicious of Warren Hart. But before anything substantial came of those suspicions, Warren Hart was kicked out of the group for the way he was running things. Eddie Conway, for his part, was later framed for the murder of a Baltimore police officer and served 4 decades in prison before being released. Put a pin in that, because this is a bit of a harbinger for how things are going to turn out. Not that it's ever safe or easy to be on the vanguard of a radical social movement, but this was an especially dangerous time for groups like the Panthers. You might have guessed this part already, but yeah, Warren Hart was working as a federal agent the entire time. But let's leave Warren Hart in Baltimore for a sec and set the scene for what's going on north of the border. The civil rights movement in the United States and the radical politics that came with it obviously were having an effect in Canada. Here's David Austin, author of Fear of a Black Nation.
Now, of course, you have the civil rights and the Black Power movement in the United States, the emergence of groups by 1966 like the Black Panther Party, and all of that reverberated within Canada too, from Nova Scotia, Montreal, and in Toronto. Many Black folks, in large part as a result of poverty, were forced to live in substandard housing in some of the poor districts of Montreal, mostly in the Southwest. That Black population in the 1960s became restive and became organized in various ways. And that produced this mortal sense of fear, this mortal sense of dread in the eyes of the state policing apparatus.
In the late 60s and 70s, Montreal was quickly becoming a key site of Black and particularly Caribbean radical politics. And the RCMP, Canada's state police, were terrified. Because of course they were. All of this was threatening the thing that they hold most dear, the status quo. Documents show that the RCMP at the time truly believed that Black liberation and other movements like it could destroy the Canadian state as we know it if left unchecked. And it's moments like the Sir George Williams affair that probably made them think that. So the Sir George Williams affair, or the Concordia computer riots, is this watershed moment that happens in Montreal in 1969. The year prior, several West Indian students were accusing a professor at Sir George Williams University, now known as Concordia University, of unfair and discriminatory grading practices. Essentially, they said he was failing black students systematically. Predictably, administration did very little about this, so students took things into their own hands. Hundreds of students occupied the 9th floor computer lab of the Henry F. Hall building in a 2-week-long protest that ended in a huge and mysterious fire that we still don't know who started, causing millions of dollars of damage. Riot police stormed in, arresting many of the students. The whole thing was highly televised and very much a big deal. So the RCMP is all stressed out now, and in April of 1971, they asked their neighbors to the south a favor. They say they're looking for someone with, quote, expertise in infiltrating black radical organizations. And the Americans respond, we know just the guy. A meeting between the relevant parties takes place, and before you know it, our guy Warren Hart is in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And Warren Hart was assigned his first target, a young political activist from Dominica named Rosie Douglas. Douglas studied in Canada, first in Toronto, then in Montreal. But after seeing how Black and Indigenous communities were being treated in Canada, his views quickly and understandably radicalized, and he became one of the most prominent Black activists in Canada, even becoming acquainted with the likes of Dr. Martin Luther King and Kwame Ture, who at the time was going by Stokely Carmichael. Oh, and I should probably mention, Rosie Douglas was one of the leaders of the 1969 computer riots, so the RCMP really didn't like this guy. And while serving 18 months in prison for his role in the protests, he happens to meet this guy, a fellow prisoner, a former Black Panther from the States, ex-military background. And the result of this meet cute is that this guy becomes Rosie Douglas's chauffeur, bodyguard, and confidant. Yes, this is Warren Hart. Of course it's Warren Hart. It's always Warren Hart. So now Warren Hart is tagging along as Rosie Douglas goes from coast to coast speaking to and building solidarity with Black and Indigenous communities. He's going by Clay Hart now, and sometimes by the General when he's feeling spicy, I guess. And he's pulling all kinds of shit now. For instance, in an attempt to entrap them, presumably, he offered Indigenous activists in BC, quote, unlimited supplies of high-quality military equipment, including AK-47s, dynamite, and plastic explosives. Jesus Christ. Here's the part where I should probably tell you about his MO during his years in Canada, because it's ridiculous, like it's almost comical. So based on first-hand accounts, he would basically just show up to meetings of Black and Indigenous groups and incessantly and unsubtly bring up killing cops and offing pigs to the point that he would just make everyone in the room really uncomfortable.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
But aside from how goofy that looks in hindsight, Hart and other people who were involved in what's now referred to as the Dirty Tricks Department of the RCMP did real substantial damage. From espionage to arming Black and Indigenous communities, to burning a barn to the ground in Quebec to stop a Black Panther meeting, to planting bombs and blaming it on Quebec separatists, these dirty tricks were basically the Canadian equivalent of the Americans' counterintelligence program. So remember Rosie Douglas? He was eventually deported from Canada back to Dominica. While in literal leg irons and handcuffs, he vowed that he would only return to Canada as Prime Minister of his own country. And the amazing part is he actually kept good on that promise, returning to Canada years later as the Prime Minister of Dominica on an official state visit. But in case you haven't noticed the pattern here, Warren Hart shows up out of nowhere, gains the trust of your group, and a few months or years later, one of you's walking away in handcuffs. And by then, Warren Hart is long gone. So how do we know all of this? Because the Canadian government is not really famous for its transparency. Hilariously, we know this because Warren Hart, out of frustration, just went public. He was pissed at the RCMP because apparently they didn't hold up their end of the bargain. According to him, they promised him like citizenship or residency and way more money than he apparently actually received. So between Warren Hart and the whole planting bombs and blaming it on Quebec separatist shenanigans, this massive multi-year inquiry called the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Certain Activities of the RCMP, or the MacDonald Commission for short, was established, revealing a lot of the unsavory business that the RCMP had been involved in for years. But that's largely where this story ends. Well, that's not true. There was that one time he tried to smuggle weapons to the South African apartheid government, and who could forget his final misadventure, getting arrested for trafficking cocaine in Miami before dying in prison in 2007. But that's largely irrelevant, because you know what? I don't care about Warren Hart anymore. I know, I started this video talking about how important he was, but the more I dug into it, the more I realized that no one remembers him because he's not really the one that mattered. He was just an opportunist, a criminal, and ultimately a pawn. First for the NSA, then for the FBI, and finally for the RCMP. The real story here isn't about a globe-trotting agent of chaos. No, the real story here is how far and how low the RCMP was willing to go to turn Black and Indigenous youth into hardened criminals that they could lock up, instead of putting those same resources towards uplifting and empowering those same communities. The real story here is about people like Rosie Douglas, Eddie Conway, and Ricky Atkinson. I haven't told you about Atkinson yet, but he was one of the young Canadians who had a gun put in their hands by Warren Hart. I'll leave you with what he had to say about it on an episode of Commons.
To take a 16-year-old kid who really doesn't have a criminal record and push him into major criminality when they could have did the opposite. They chose a marginalized group of people to exploit, criminalize, and then profited by it. He doesn't have a government. They profited by saying publicly, we have a handle on Black radicalism in our country. He was a crooked cop. He wasn't good for this government. He sucked this government in. He sucked us in as kids, but he also sucked in the federal government at the time because he wasn't a good guy. They hired a criminal to catch criminals that didn't exist. He made the criminals so that they would exist so he can get paid.
The story of Warren Hart is one of countless stories that paint Canada as a far more interesting place than the average person would tend to think. And at the risk of sounding defensive, I want to let you know that we've put together a curated ad-free collection of podcasts all about wild and unbelievable stories that, you guessed it, happened in Canada. One of those episodes is actually all about Ricky Atkinson, the person you just heard from, and how his life was forever changed by Warren Hart. So if you enjoyed this video, go check out that collection of podcasts. You're gonna love it. There's a link in the description, or you can click the I in the corner of your screen. And of course, thank you so much for watching. We're trying something new here at Canada Land, so if you enjoyed this, let us know what you thought about this story in the comments down below. Leave us a like. Consider subscribing to this channel, and also consider subscribing to our podcast channel. And why not be a part of the solution to Canada's journalism crisis? Become a supporter at canadaland.com/join.